They say you should keep your friends close and your enemies closer. But what if the person you trust most is doing the same to you? In this quiet Staffordshire village, life is peaceful. Stone cottages, leafy streets, not the usual backdrop for truly evil crimes. But behind the doors of one quaint little cottage, something quite sinister is brewing. When a severely disabled man passes away in his sleep, nobody suspects foul play. But a series of peculiar details catches the eye of one detective, and he begins to unpick a despicable story of manipulation, greed, and betrayal. Hello and welcome to my humble establishment. Steve, the shopkeeper of the sinister, at your service. And in store today we have another grim case from the UK. A story riddled with backstabbery and deceit. It's the case of Gregory Baker. This story begins in the English Midlands and the county of Staffordshire. There you'll find Alton, best known as the home of Alton Towers, the UK's largest theme park. 550 acres of adrenaline-inducing rides, landscaped gardens, and twisting roller coasters that have been turning knuckles white since the 1980s. But the actual village of Alton, well, it's quite the strange contrast. Alton is the quintessentially British village. Overlooked by a medieval-style castle, its cobbled roads, country pubs and traditional stone cottages line the winding lanes. It's a quaint, historic, sleepy little village. Certainly not the sort of place you'd expect to find a man murdered in peculiar circumstances, unless you watch a lot of Midsummer Murders. And in one of these cottages lived a man named Gregory Baker. Gregory was a 61-year-old whose life had begun with difficult challenges. As a child, he was left with poor mobility after a tough bout with polio. As if that weren't enough, he later began suffering from muscular dystrophy, a genetic condition that gradually weakens the muscles. By 2007, when our story begins, he was housebound and severely disabled. But though his body was broken, mentally he was fit as a fiddle. Gregory was a gifted mathematician. He lived alone in Cottage, the home he'd inherited from his mother, and made a modest income tutoring local youngsters. He was well known in the village, a much-loved member of the community. In spite of his physical setbacks, he still got involved with local events and attended church regularly, with the help of his team of carers, of course. He relied on them for most things these days. Life continued to be a challenge. But there was one person who offered a little brightness in Gregory's otherwise difficult years of late. This is Thelma Yvonne Purchase. She was one of Gregory's carers, his most trusted in fact. What began as just another placement from a care agency soon blossomed into an unexpected and very real friendship. Thelma wasn't just a caregiver, she was somebody Gregory would confide in. He even described her as his best friend. And Thelma, she liked to say their relationship was like that of a father and daughter. After 6 years, Thelma eventually moved on to a job in social services, but the two remained close. Thelma still called and visited often, even brought her son Lance for Gregory to tutor. It seemed like a bond built on trust, loyalty, and genuine affection. It was a Saturday in the summer of 2007, a routine morning visit from one of Gregory's carers. She let herself into Cottage. The door was unlocked. This wasn't unusual. Gregory preferred it this way, in case of emergency. It didn't strike anyone as unsafe. Alton, after all, was hardly rife with crime. What was unusual was Gregory didn't stir. She tried to rouse him, but he was completely unresponsive. It seemed he'd passed away in his sleep. At first, there was nothing to suggest foul play. The 61-year-old appeared to have died of natural causes. After all, he was not a well man, and it isn't unheard of for sufferers of muscular dystrophy to die in their sleep, often due to weakness in the respiratory muscles. But there was something not quite right in the room. Something was missing. Gregory's pillow. It was a big, specialist pillow, important to him. It propped him up and kept him comfortable. And now, it was nowhere in sight. Soon after, a neighbour came to the door holding something he'd discovered, a distinctive pullover that belonged to Gregory. It was found hanging over a post just down the road, somewhere he couldn't possibly get to unassisted. And there was one more thing amiss. Every Friday, one of his carers left £500 in the top pocket of his pyjamas, a weekly routine that allowed him to pay his other carers for the days ahead, and for any groceries and sundries he might need. But on this strange Saturday morning, the money was gone. None of this was enough to suggest murder, of course, but these suspicious little abnormalities were enough for police to take notice, and so the investigation into Gregory Baker's death began cautiously. The case was led by Detective Ken Raper, who had some initial questions. Was this neglect, an accident, or something far more sinister? There was enough suspicion for the detective to demand a forensic post-mortem, and his worst fears were realised. It turned out Gregory Baker hadn't slipped away peacefully at all. The pathologist discovered pinpoint hemorrhaging around his eyes, and soft tissue trauma on the inside of his lips and cheeks, as though something had been pressed firmly against his face. The conclusion? He'd likely died from asphyxiation, specifically suffocation by smothering. Police were now facing a murder investigation, and they suspected the missing pillow was the weapon used on the unfortunate Gregory Baker. Next, they needed a motive. Why would anyone want to harm this defenseless man? Initially, a botched burglary was considered, but several items of value had been left untouched, and it seemed unlikely that a burglar would have found it necessary to end the man's life. No, Gregory's killer was somebody who knew him, who knew his door was always left unlocked at night, who knew about the £500 in his top pocket. This was no random crime. It was a targeted killing. Gregory had been murdered by someone he trusted. It led police to consider who stood to benefit from his death. Police began compiling a list of possible suspects. Naturally, they turned first to those who had intimate knowledge of Gregory and his routine, the people who saw him every day, his carers. Each was interviewed, and something pretty disturbing emerged. It turned out that Thelma and Gregory's relationship was a little more than father-daughter. 2 other carers had caught them cuddling and kissing, and on more than one occasion Thelma was even seen sitting on his lap. Not exactly appropriate behaviour for a trusted caregiver. As things progressed, Gregory began showering Thelma with gifts. He gave money to her and her children. He was known for his generosity, but even for him, he was really treating Thelma well, and it didn't go unnoticed. By all accounts, Gregory was totally and utterly infatuated with the 44-year-old. In fact, he often asked her to marry him. Some grew suspicious that Thelma was taking advantage of him, using him for his money, but nobody said a thing. They didn't want to burst the poor man's bubble. As things escalated, he even gifted her £1,500 towards a new car, a blue Citroen Saxo. A reputable carer is supposed to reject such gifts. But that wasn't all. When detectives examined Gregory's will, there it was in black and white. Thelma Yvonne Purchase, main beneficiary. She stood to inherit almost £60,000 from his death and the sale of his cottage. This raised serious questions for police. Gregory undoubtedly loved her, but did she love him back, or had she simply enjoyed the attention and the generosity? Police couldn't yet be sure, but one thing was clear: Thelma Purchase had a motive, and she knew Gregory's routine well enough to exploit it. But had she actually played a part in his death? As detectives dug deeper into Thelma's background, they began to unearth a rather unsavoury character, and that's putting it mildly. While she was becoming romantically entangled with Gregory, she actually had a long-term partner, a man named Kelvin Amos. She'd just moved into his house, and he had no idea his girlfriend and her client were anything more than good friends. But that wasn't her only secret. When detectives spoke to Thelma's acquaintances, one woman in particular, a well-known career criminal, offered some shocking information. She had evidence that Thelma had tried to hire a number of people to assassinate Kelvin, an attempt to claim on his life insurance. Fortunately, she was unable to find anybody willing to carry out the killing. When this didn't work, Thelma turned to plan B. She accused Kelvin of domestic violence. She wanted him out of the house so she could keep it for herself. She had him arrested on more than one occasion. But Kelvin was innocent. He'd never laid a finger on her, and he had no idea she'd tried to have him executed until years later, when her so-called friend revealed the sinister plot. What was no secret was that Thelma Purchase had a real taste for money, and evidently a history of trying just about anything to get her hands on it. Detectives next turned their attention to Thelma's finances. On the surface, it looked like she was doing okay. She lived on a social housing estate in the nearby city of Stoke, but investigators described her house as a show home, immaculate, as if it had been staged for a magazine. But behind the polish, things weren't so neat. When police checked her account, it was obvious she was struggling to make ends meet. At one point, she received £8,500 in back pay and burned through it on landscaping her garden, a new plasma TV, and keeping up appearances. Now her lifestyle looked lavish, but she didn't have the means to fund it, and this added fuel to the motive. Thelma needed the money. Detectives were now convinced Thelma was involved, but one question loomed large. How? She was small and slight. She just didn't strike them as someone capable of committing a murder that required excessive force, even against a disabled man like Gregory. And all they had was circumstantial. Her relationship with Gregory, her debts, her sudden appearance in his will. It all raised eyebrows, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Detectives still needed something solid. That's when they got their first real break. Out of the blue, an informant came forward, with a story that would change the entire course of this case. The informant claimed that somebody they knew was involved in a murder. Lance Rudge, Thelma's 19-year-old son. Lance had his own troubled history. His behaviour deteriorated throughout his school years, until he was eventually expelled for smoking cannabis on school grounds. In recent years, he'd become involved in escalating criminal activities, like mother like son. Lance lived with Thelma, but he spent a lot of time at one particular place, a house share filled with other wayward young men, one of which was the police informant. According to him, Lance had one day walked in and simply asked, "Anyone here prepared to kill for money?" One person said yes, Lance's friend, 19-year-old Shane Edge. And allegedly, amid the smoke and chatter of a family barbecue, the fine details of the murder plot were thrashed out. Following the night of Gregory's death, Shane stumbled back into the house share in the early hours, wearing no shoes, and he uttered the chilling words, "I've done it. I've killed him." Apparently both Shane and Lance had stood to gain a significant chunk of cash from Thelma for carrying out the killing, courtesy of Gregory's will money. It seemed that he'd unknowingly funded his own murder. All three were arrested, and as you might expect, all three denied it. In fact, they took the opportunity to blame one another. It was a classic finger-pointing circle. Lance claimed he wasn't involved, but was told about the murder afterwards by Shane. Shane denied playing any part in the crime. And Thelma, she didn't even know she was a beneficiary in Greg's will until she was arrested, which was weird because even Kelvin knew about it. As for the evening of the murder, she didn't leave home that entire night. Her car was on the driveway the whole time. Well, I guess that's that then.
Elephant shit.
Detectives knew Thelma was lying, but they couldn't rely on hearsay, the unreliable word of the friends of the two young suspects. They needed hard evidence, and so began the painstaking investigation. Hundreds of hours of CCTV were reviewed, phone records cross-checked, and sightings of the trio correlated to build a map of their movements. Every detail mattered, every CCTV frame, every phone call, every network tower ping, slowly building a picture of their movements that night. Numerous calls were made between Thelma, Lance and Shane in the lead up to the murder. Network towers traced their locations, and most crucially, each of their phones pinged Alton around midnight, exactly when Gregory was killed. It never fails to amaze me when killers carry their phone throughout a crime, and here all three of them did. And contrary to what Thelma had claimed, her car had in fact left her home that evening. Several cameras caught it that night. This still, from Mere Tunnel, shows it leaving Stoke and heading toward Alton, 11 miles away. In the early hours of the morning, both Shane and Lance were caught on a 24-hour supermarket CCTV camera. They spent lavishly, bought lots of booze and cash. And strangely, Shane didn't appear to be wearing shoes. In the meantime, detectives scoured Thelma's home for clues. There was nothing. The place was clean. But in the garden, something caught the attention of one keen-eyed officer. One of the freshly laid concrete slabs had faint scorch marks around the edge. When they lifted it, they found a tiny thread of cotton, fused to what looked like the charred remnant of a small feather. The fragment was sent to an expert at London's Natural History Museum. The verdict? The burnt remains were that of a chicken feather, the type of down used as stuffing in pillows. Detectives took the cotton to several pillow manufacturers in the Midlands, and incredibly, one of them recognised the distinctive type of machining that had been used on the thread. It was from a particular type of pillow that had come from their factory, just like the one missing from Gregory's house, and now one that had been burnt in Thelma's garden. And this seemingly insignificant little chicken feather was the unusual final nail in Thelma Purchase's coffin. The trial began in June 2008 at Stafford Crown Court. All three continued to deny involvement, even under the weight of all the evidence. Thelma stuck to her story. She hadn't left home. In one final cruel twist, she told the courtroom that she'd loaned her car to her son. He wanted to go and buy some drugs. He and his friend must have committed the crime. She had no idea about any of it. Her phone was in the glove compartment the whole time, which explains why it was picked up in Alton. Well, she's not exactly going to be winning any Mother of the Year awards, is she? This is what the prosecutor had to say. When you take a moment to think about it, the wickedness of that lie was that she was prepared to sacrifice her own son to save her skin. There can be no greater betrayal of a mother and her son than to frame him in that way. In response, Lance leapt across a barrier and tried to attack his mother in the courtroom before he was restrained. He said in that moment he saw just how evil she could be. It was callous, and the prosecution saw through the lies. Thelma was the orchestrator, and she stood to make the lion's share of the money. Here's how they put it to the jury. Thelma Yvonne Purchase is a greedy, manipulative woman who seduced Gregory into including her in his will. The moment he did, he sealed his fate, because she didn't want to wait for him to die of natural causes before getting her sticky fingers all over that lovely money. Who knew how long that might be? But she didn't want to get her hands dirty either, so she roped her own son into the sick plot. She urged him to ask around, to see if any of his friends would kill for money. She would give each of them £8,000. In a cruel twist of irony, Thelma drove Lance and Shane to Alton to kill Gregory in the very same car that he'd purchased for her. CCTV caught the journey, and phone records placed all three near Corner Cottage that night. While Thelma and Lance waited outside, Shane crept into the unlocked home and began smothering Gregory with his own pillow. He was incapable of fighting back. Shane later told a friend that Gregory had woken up and asked, "Why are you killing me?" Those were his final words. Shane sat on Gregory's chest to expel the air from his lungs and suffocated the defenseless man. Thelma knew it would look as though Gregory had passed away in his sleep, and after all, the safest victims are those already expected to die. Shane took the £500 and the murder weapon. It was the perfect crime, were it not for these missing items. As for Gregory's pullover, it was never established how or why it ended up down the road. Thelma took the pillow and Shane's shoes in case they carried any evidence from the crime scene. This is why Shane was caught spending his newfound cash in his socks. Back home, Shane told his housemates he'd killed the man, even had the audacity to complain that his arms ached from the effort of it. And finally, Thelma burned the evidence in her courtyard, except for one tiny little telltale chicken feather that survived the inferno. The trial lasted 5 weeks, and after careful deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. All three convicted of the murder of Gregory Baker. The trio was sentenced the following month for a murder described as a cowardly, callous, contract-style killing motivated purely by greed. The judge told the trio, "You have murdered a generous, intelligent, and well-loved man. I have to sentence you for a truly horrible crime. A disabled man aged 61 was murdered in his own bed, in his own home, with his own pillow." All three were handed life sentences. As the mastermind, Thelma Purchase was ordered to serve at least 30 years. Her son, Lance Rudge, received a minimum of 18 years, and Shane Edge will spend at least 20 years behind bars. None of the three showed any emotion. Thelma was also found guilty of soliciting a woman to kill her boyfriend, and of perverting the course of justice by trying to persuade her to withdraw her evidence. For these offences, she was given a total of 6 years to be served alongside her life sentence. In 2009, Thelma launched an appeal to have her sentence reduced. She said it was unfair that she got so much longer than the other two. The appeal was rejected by judges, who ruled her sentence was richly deserved. Thelma Yvonne Purchase will not be considered for parole until she is 73. In 2012, Lance Rudge was interviewed for Channel 4's Lifers. He said being on trial for murder was boring, and he fell asleep 5 times. He boasted that he loved prison because he didn't need to get a job. He told the interviewer, "In here, you've got everything. You've got a stereo, a TV, you've got your food, 3 meals a day. I've got it nice. I don't want it to change." Detective Ken Raper said he was saddened by the remarks, and Lance's utter lack of remorse. Thelma Yvonne Purchase is without a doubt one of the most narcissistic little. She betrayed Gregory, luring him into her evil web of deceit. She betrayed Calvin, trying to have him offed so she could get her greedy, manipulative hands on his house, and she even betrayed her own son, trying to pin the entire scheme on him, just to save her own skin. What a disgusting snake. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you appreciated this video, please show some love by hitting like, subscribing, and turning on the bell so you don't miss the next story. And hopefully, I'll see you again next time. Take care.